I apologize in advance if this ends up being super long. Well, I have tried getting through all of the movies of 2015 and putting my reviews out for them. Um, but as I'm sure you all know by now, I have just moved into this apartment recently, and a combination of my work life and home life have just been keeping me very distracted lately. I am going to try to have a more consistent schedule in the future. At least I'll try to post a little more frequently. But anyway, the whole reason I'm doing this video is because as of filming this right now, we're getting close to the summer of 2016, and I'm starting to realize that while viewing every single 2015 film that I have a desire to see and posting my review for it isn't necessarily a thing that will never get done, it's just clearly going to take a long time. These are the notes that I've taken on the films that I have seen from 2015 and have yet to review on this channel. I just wrote down some quick thoughts as well as the title of those movies so that I wouldn't forget them. And yeah, clearly something that would take a long time if I did an individual video for each and every one of them. And I did write my thoughts on both sides of those note cards. Um, anyway, you know, one of the main reasons that I'm wanting to move on is because one of my subscribers on here requested that I check out The Body and The House at the End of Time and review those. I've got copies of each of those movies, which I haven't watched yet, but I'm going to try to get to those as soon as possible. And not only that, but I mentioned in my little moving update that I was going to review The Witch. I'm going to try to get to that within the next couple of days. And I'm also going to share my thoughts on a couple of other 2016 films in the future. Now, there are some 2015 films I have not seen yet. So if you don't hear me mention them in this video, and if I've never talked about them before, just, let me know in the comments if you want to hear my thoughts on a particular movie, and we'll go from there. I'll let you know if I'm interested. Anyway, let's get into this. First up, the Peanuts movie. I loved how true this film was to the source material. Every single kid felt just like, the kids from the classic Peanuts cartoons. I love the kind of stylized animation where it had the same jerky movements as the original hand-drawn material. It was hilarious. It had a great lesson for kids, and it easily had the best scenes with Snoopy as the Red Baron that I've seen so far. I would definitely recommend it. Next up, there's Trainwreck. I'm actually a fan of Amy Schumer. I know a lot of people don't like her, but I thought she was really funny in this movie. Pretty much everybody else brought the funny as well. Schumer herself even portrayed some real acting. She did a great job at pulling off the emotional moments. My only complaints with the film were that the relationship that she gets into had kind of an awkward setup, and as it went on, it went into the exact type of romantic comedy tropes that you've seen a million times. But as long as you can get over that, if you, like me, find Amy Schumer funny, then I'd recommend checking it out. Next is We Are Still Here, which is a very cool, creepy, atmospheric ghost story. The lead characters in it are very likable. One thing that I find kind of questionable is, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that people who reviewed this movie said that it was as much of a comedy as it was a horror film. I wasn't really getting that. until Larry Fessenden, I think is the right inflection, showed up on the screen. He was very likable to watch as usual. Um, I don't know. I guess that outside of his character, most of the humor must have just flown over my head. And I also love the final act of this film where it becomes a full on bloodbath. I definitely recommend checking it out. Next is What We Do in the Shadows, which a lot of people have hyped up as being like one of the funniest movies in recent memory. But I have to say, upon watching it, it's definitely worth the hype for me. The characters are all these likable jerks. I love how they kind of play with the different types of vampires that we've seen in pop culture. I love the little conversation they have about virgin blood. The visual effects are great. The cinematography is well done. Overall, it's just a very well made comedy. Check it out. Next is When Marnie Was There, which is a Japanese anime ghost story drama. Um, I love how very real the characters were in this movie. Whenever they were talking to each other, it felt very natural. The lead character was very frustrating, but again, it just came off in a very realistic sense. Um, However, I kind of had the same relationship with this movie as I did with the Last Picture Show, where um, I do acknowledge that it is well made. It's a pretty good drama film, but for me personally, it just wasn't all that engaging. There were a couple of moments where I thought it was a little too sappy, although I thought the ending was pretty awesome. So if it sounds like something you'd be interested in, check it out. Next is Yakuza Apocalypse, which is a very different kind of Japanese film, to say the least. This one is in live action. It's one of the newer films by Takashi Miike, although that could change very quickly because he's constantly making films. I mean, have you seen the man's resume? Um, anyway, to call this movie weird would definitely be an understatement. There are these crazy mythical creatures that just kind of pop up out of nowhere. There's a detective woman who at one point leans over and pees out of her ear. It, I really have just as much of a clue as you do as to why she does that. Um, and it is also an action movie, as you could pretty much tell from the title. And the choreography is decent. It's not what you would typically get with like an Asian action film, um, but I didn't necessarily see this for the action. I saw it for Takashi Miike's sort of trademark gore, and I continued watching for Japan's trademark weirdness. Anyone who's been watching this channel for a while knows that I love my weird Japanese films, and if you do as well, then I'd recommend checking this one out. Next is Bone Tomahawk, which is a Western horror film starring Kurt Russell. This is a very slow burning movie, but the pacing does feel necessary in this instance, where it allows the characters to be more fleshed out. The acting is top notch all around, and this really isn't a spoiler when I mention that Bone Tomahawk is a cannibal movie. And there was another cannibal movie I recall coming out in 2015, which a lot of people raved about how gory and violent it was. Now, Bone Tomahawk isn't as gory and it doesn't have as many violent scenes, but I can tell you that there is one solitary death scene in this movie which outdoes everything that the Green Inferno had on display by a mile. So I would say proceed with caution, but if you can stomach it, then Bone Tomahawk does come recommended. Next is Condemned, not to be confused with the Stone Cold action movie of a similar name. This is a zombie horror film, and it is one of the most batshit crazy horror movies that I've seen in recent memory. I love the intro. I love the camera work. the characters are all around very unlikable, but also very interesting and entertaining to watch. It's just a really fun kind of gross out movie in the vein of Dead Alive or Bad Taste. So if you're a fan of those types of movies, then Condemned comes highly recommended. Next is Deathgasm, or as you can probably find it at Walmart, Heavy Metal Apocalypse. I fucking hate censorship. This is quite possibly the most metal horror film that I've seen. Just the sets, the t-shirts that the lead characters are wearing, the soundtrack, everything, you know, makes it feel like this was made by metalheads for metalheads. The pacing of this movie is very fast. The visuals often feel like something straight out of a heavy metal music video. And if you're looking for a new Evil Dead movie that feels more like the classic Evil Dead movies, then this should be right up your alley. It's got a lot of funny slapstick in it. The characters are extremely silly, and I love this movie. Next is a film which may not sound like something that I would watch, and I initially did not have any plans to watch it, but after hearing some reviews for it, it sounded pretty decent, so I decided to go ahead and check out The Duff. And as it turns out, I found it to be a pretty likable movie. It has gotten some mixed opinions. I mean, on the one hand, there are reviewers who say that it's the next Mean Girls, while on the other side of the spectrum, I believe it was Brad Jones, the cinema snob, who said that this was one of the worst films of 2015. So, who knows what you're going to think. For my money, I thought it was worth it. I thought it was a fun journey. The jokes hit pretty well for the most part. I found the characters very likable. The only complaint that I have is that it is highly predictable. I mean, the main character falls for this musician guy who you never really get to know as a character until she finally gets to go out with him. On the other hand, the person who helps her, who gives her dating advice and kind of helps with her image, is this Studley boy who she's known since childhood. If you don't correctly guess who she's going to end up with at the end of the movie, you clearly don't know anything about movies. But anyway, if The Duff sounds like your cup of tea, then check it out. If it doesn't, then go ahead and skip it. I don't care. That right there is a lot of positive reviews in a row. That's about to change. The next film in line is Hell and Back, which is a stop-motion animated adult comedy. I thought this was going to be awesome. It should have been awesome, but as it is, the animation was very standard. The character designs were fucking hideous. The comedy in this movie mostly doesn't hit. I'll get into one of the jokes that did hit in just a moment, but I mean, there's a really dumb attempt at mean-spirited comedy where a gypsy woman is telling this guy that he's raping his hand, it's not giving his consent. There's another joke about tree rape. They make this really misguided kind of jab at rape culture, asking the victim what he was wearing at the time. The Devil, this is a movie where, you know, the main characters literally go to hell and back. The Devil is in this movie. He's just really boring. I mean, he is an asshole in this movie, but he could have been a little more of an asshole. He could have at least been funnier. Everything about this movie could have been funnier. The only jokes that I felt were even remotely amusing were some of the punishments that they were giving out to people. Like, there's a part where I think this place had like a sign saying that it was Taco Bell and Pizza Hut. But when this guy tries to order a pizza, it turns out that he can only order Taco Bell because he's in hell. Um, there's another guy who gets a tub of Neapolitan ice cream, but he finds out that all of the chocolate and all of the vanilla have been eaten, so all he has left is the strawberry because he's in hell. Um, and, I think it's pretty dumb to spoil a good joke from a comedy, but again, the hell punishments are the only good jokes in this movie, so now that you know them, there's nothing else to see. Skip it. Next is Howl, which is a gory werewolf movie that takes place on a train. Um, there are some things that I have mixed thoughts with on this movie, but I do like it overall. I bought it on DVD once it came out, and after seeing it, I kept the DVD if that tells you anything. But while the movie is very well acted, I found a lot of the characters set up at the beginning to be pretty boring and dull. Um, and while the werewolf designs in this movie were awesome and very much unlike anything I'd seen before, the CGI was pretty fucking cheesy. So, the movie does come recommended as long as you can get over some of the negatives that I've pointed out. Next is How to Save Us, a movie about essentially a ghost apocalypse. This could have been a pretty cool idea. I mean, the idea itself is cool, but the movie itself is fucking boring. There's one whole scene dedicated to a guy playing frisbee with himself on the beach. How captivating does that sound? The only reason I could ever recommend this movie would be if you had a chronic case of insomnia. This would cure it in a heartbeat. Next is LA Slasher, which it turns out isn't as much of a slasher movie as it is an art house comedy. It's basically meant to be a satire on celebrity culture and how we view reality stars and people of that sort as not necessarily human. And for a while it was pretty interesting. There were some parts that I found funny. The cast is very interesting. The slasher himself is played by Andy Dick, and the character himself isn't quite as creepy as the fact that Andy Dick may be showing up to some horror conventions soon. Um, as it is, after a while, the movie started to get a little too repetitive. Like, some reality star would die and they'd start reporting on it, blah. And the final act was just downright boring. So, unless you're really into art house, then this one doesn't come recommended. Next is Some Kind of Hate, which is yet another film that I mentioned in my update video about moving. Basically, imagine the film Holes if it was a supernatural slasher film, and now also imagine if it was boring as hell. You would have Some Kind of Hate. The lead character is incredibly dull. He is just this very standard sort of outsider emo kid. I know the phrase emo is a little dated, but that's really the best way I can describe him. Um, the fucking camp that these juvenile delinquents go to is probably the most incompetent that I've seen on film. It makes the one from Holes seem professional in comparison. Um, I will admit that it got a little more interesting once the slasher element came into play. There are some really good gore effects in this film. Some of the kill scenes were fairly effective, but it doesn't really make this a good movie by any means. Unless you're an extreme gore hound, then this is yet another one that does not come recommended. Next is Stung, which is a horror comedy about giant wasps or hornets. I don't quite remember which. You'll have to forgive me. The film itself is not all that memorable because it's really not that funny. It sometimes takes itself a little too seriously, which isn't helped by the fact that the characters are weak as hell. The only time where the movie becomes like full on silly is the very end. I thought the ending was hilarious, but I mean, it didn't feel like as a comedy it was going far enough until it was too late. Um, Another good thing that I can say for the movie, aside from the ending, is that the effects were pretty fucking awesome. For a B movie about these giant killer stinging bugs, either wasps or hornets, they used a surprising amount of practical effects and puppetry in this movie. I expected it to just be a bunch of these shitty looking CGI bugs flying around, but no, they actually went the extra mile. And while I do appreciate that it, you know, like a movie that's very gory and very nasty, doesn't necessarily make this a good movie, and I would recommend skipping it. Finally, my last movie for review in this video is a horror film which is appropriately enough titled Last Shift. Now, the DVD cover for this movie looked pretty wild, and going in, I expected more of an all-out bloodbath, more along the lines of Condemned. But as it turns out, while it does have some gory moments, Last Shift is really more of a psychological, supernatural horror film. And the bloodier scenes don't feel like they're being unnecessarily gratuitous or over the top. Really, whenever they happen, it feels like they're punctuating the horror. And the lead actress in this film gives an excellent performance. Even in the scenes where she's not saying anything, you can see what she's thinking just from the expressions on her face. And I will admit that this film does come off as a bit derivative in parts. Like, there is a scene which feels straight up like something out of The Sixth Sense. I'm sure that you'll know it when you see it. I'm not talking about the ending. Don't worry, I did not spoil this for you. And I guarantee that the Sixth Sense scene is one that you are not going to see coming. So despite some of the slightly lacking originality in this film, I did find it very effective. I never knew what was going to happen next, and overall, Last Shift is a very well done horror film that comes highly recommended. Anyway, that's all I've got to say in this video. Again, I'm going to try to keep a more consistent schedule in the future. Hopefully my next review is going to be up within a couple of days from now. And until next time, I hope you all have a good one.